Kia ora koutou and welcome to Lunch on the Way. We're three guys doing theology over lunch, and sometimes we'll do it with others. We'll have to warn you, though, that what's said here is not yet complete because, like any good conversation, you don't want it to end. So please join us for Lunch on the Way. Hey, everyone. I'm Joey Millington, joined by Jonathan Hoskin and Greame Flett, but Greame Flett is not here.
Graham's away.
He's not here again, but it's not because he's got watching TV or Netflix or something. He's doing his job. So we can always forgive him for that. We'll let him off for that. But today we had the pleasure of doing what, Jonathan?
Wow. Oh, you tell me. Who did we just talk with?
We just talked with Roshan Allpress, the national principal of Laidlaw College, and man, we went.
It was a wide-ranging conversation.
It was,
as you would expect from Roshan.
Yeah.
He's a broad thinker. He's a deep thinker. So, and I think that really shows through.
Yeah.
In this conversation.
So we're not going to do a bit of a bio on him because he talks a bit about that at the very beginning about his life. But we went in and talked about institution and Laidlaw's institution and Christian institutions in New Zealand and what's the role. And then we kind of looked at like what does renewal and a revival look like, and then what does the church in Aotearoa, New Zealand kind of have down the pike or in the future, and what is the role of a Christian institution or Christian institutions in that future? What was probably like one of your takeaways you would say, Jonathan, in the conversation?
My highlight was actually the very beginning when we kind of dug into Roshan's kind of upbringing. Yeah. And I was really interested when he talked about finding mentors, people that had a lived Christian faith that you could learn from, and that you respect and you want to be like, and go to them and say, how can I emulate you? I found that incredibly inspiring. Yeah. Because I think it's one thing that we don't have. We don't have those older Christians who are willing to share their faith with younger folk,
or even just to initiate it, right?
Yeah, to initiate it. Yeah.
I think
so. That was great.
Yeah, that was excellent. And honestly, I think for most people who have been faithful and have been doing maybe significant things for Jesus, they probably had similar stories like that, where it's somebody who's older, who's really taken time to invest in them, right?
Yeah, that's right. I think it ties nicely back to where he's saying at the end of the conversation, he's saying, get back involved with your local parish, because that's where you're going to meet people, where you can have these conversations with them. Yeah. What was the highlight for you? My
highlight was his definition of like what a Christian institution really was supposed to do and be. Brilliant. And I was like, oh, it's so succinct. He said Christian institutions are supposed to foster faithfulness. That's what they do. If you could summarize it into one thing, it's fostering faithfulness. Yeah. Whether big or small. And I was like, that is so helpful. Yeah. Anyway, well, here's that conversation with Roshan Allpress.
Let's do it.
Cool. So, first, I just want to say thanks for coming. Thanks for being here to Lunch on the Way. Awesome. You are the national principal of Laidlaw College, which is a Christian institution.
That is true.
Instead of asking, how did you get?
Fact check.
Oh, good. Glad. Instead of asking like, how did you get to this position? Because that's a story in itself. I want to really, and I don't want to really ask, what's your testimony or life bio? Because that could take the full hour in and of itself. But what would you say is your calling, and how have you arrived at what your present understanding of your calling might be? And if that is your life story a little bit with like Laidlaw, just to kind of lay the foundation to maybe the conversation that we're going to have.
Yeah, that's a great question. So first to say, it's been an evolving sense. This is not like, and so ask me in a year's or 10 years time, and I'm sure I'll give you a slightly different answer in all of this, as I hope anyone would. Probably the best way to put it is, so I think I had a reasonably good Christian upbringing. I grew up in a really good church. It was the kind of church where there were lots of opportunities to lead, to be taught, and so forth. So it was the kind of church where there were a group of us who came up through Sunday school together. When we hit, sort of 11 or 10, 11, 12, we went to the elders and said, hey, we want a youth group. And they're like, great, you run it. So it was, and then they were like, oh, and we will help you. And so, and it was that kind of space where, once they they got us into things like leading and teaching, and of course these were just our parents and our parents' friends and all that sort of stuff. So it was a very conversational space. So in that sense, it was a space where there were lots of leadership opportunities, there was lots of formation, and it was a space where you could ask lots of questions, and there were always older, wiser people who we respected, who you could, who I found I could engage with, and who never said, no, that's a dumb question, who were also like, hey, that's a great question. Here are these 3 books that you need to read. And
what denomination was this?
It was Open Brethren. Okay. So,
okay.
It was one of these Open Brethren churches where there were a lot of people from lots of different spaces, so there was a fair amount of diversity within the congregation.
What's the difference between open or closed brethren?
A longer theological conversation and more buttons done up. No, so all that to say, that's preamble to say that. So I guess by the time I entered university, and so we'd been involved in. So I've been involved in youth leading and youth running a youth group. We got involved in the Christian group at school, went to uni. It was really natural to get involved in the university group, so we did all of that. And then leaving uni, my wife and I got married. We moved to Auckland from Christchurch, so we moved away from a whole bunch of our friends and family. And we had that sort of slightly odd experience of having a number of friends who we had walked with for years, who who we'd led groups with and so forth, some who we'd led to Christ and baptised and so forth, watched them fall away from faith in different ways, or at least watch their faith hit the skids in different things. And so all of this is by way of framing your question of vocation. I think for me, some of that initial sense of what I felt called to in the world was shaped by a sense of grief around certain things, certain disconnects. We were seeing in our friendship group and in our peers and others, disconnects between faith and scripture and life, disconnects between faith and work, and disconnects between the sense of we have this gospel, it makes sense in the world, we can live it, and it leads to kind of public engagement and leadership in different ways. So in that sense, I think for me, a lot of what I ended up doing really partly by feeling my way was we set up a thing called the Compass Foundation, which was basically trying to bridge some of these disconnects. So we were doing biblical theology, Christian leadership, and it was both I think we were meeting a real need, and there were specific missional things we were aiming for, but in some senses for me it was somewhat autobiographical. I just wanted to run some things that helped some friends of mine join some dots that I had assumed that everybody had joined, and I found difficult to join, but still was working on, if that makes sense. And it turned out, and not everyone had the same kind of conversational space. So,
and it was worth it for you to work on those points. Like you found it
and it was
and meaningful,
incredibly fun as well, because again, you got to sit with people and help join dots. And when I say help, I mean I was just running the things and providing platforms for speakers and older, wiser people who I deeply respected, and we got to invite them in, say come away to this event, and then I would just hang out with them and learn from them, while also sort of curating this space and doing that. And so in that sense, I sometimes would say, and we would often say to people who were supporting us in those early years, that Compass was driven out of those core griefs. But that was driving a series of questions that was for me. So it was basic questions like, how does the Bible have relevance to all of life? What does it mean to live out of the biblical imagination? What is the shape of Christian life and leadership, and how do you do that, not just across the course of years and in particular ministry spaces, but over decades?
Can I ask you a personal question? So what was your undergraduate in?
Yes. So in the end, a history degree. I actually did 3 years of law and computer science with economics and chemistry. Because I was interested in lots of things and didn't really know what I was doing. And at the end of that, got off at 2 years in. I did an intern. So I'd done a couple of internships with different things in software engineering and then public policy. And the public policy one started a conversation where they offered me a job and I couldn't say no, so I had to finish a degree within the next 12 months. So I took a history degree because that's what I had that's what I had the major in effectively. And it turns out I love story, and history which I'd always really just done because it was fun and I enjoyed the papers.
Interesting.
It turned out I'd done enough of them to build into a major, so I just completed that and walked out the door with a BA.
Which is interesting because if I saw your life story on paper, I would say, here's a guy going to do theology. Theology proper. So is there why did you diverge into history and not into theology?
I didn't start in theology, if that makes sense.
That's a good way to put it.
So the best way to put it is I came into theology from intellectual history. So I got obsessed in my undergrad with, so we did one paper, and to be honest, this had come from high school. I just got obsessed with the history of ideas. Yeah. So, start at the beginning, read Homer and the Bible.
Yeah.
And
okay, yes, you do.
That's good, man. That's good.
And
that's awesome.
And as you do. And so we did. And so I deliberately picked papers that allowed me to, in history and other things that allowed me to do that. And then just did a lot of other. I was a nerd. I remain a nerd. So I just read a lot.
Lifelong nerd.
I was the kind of guy who, we had one gap paper when I was in my year 13 year, and I did things like I would just go to the library and read War and Peace I just decided I would do that across the course of the year.
Yeah.
A few other things like that. And so you end up reading just a whole variety of literature, but also philosophy and so forth. And so for me, that blurred very nicely, and this was partly in that conversation around public policy. Part of the series of questions that started to come up with that forced me into further reading around systematic theology and so forth, because you need to think well about the world, you need to think intelligently, and you need to think much more deeply.
Yeah.
And I guess the church background had a grounding for me in that this are the kind of things that there are answers, and you can engage that you have to wrestle with them, but you can engage in them, and there's always good books and there's always good people.
Yeah.
So I guess it never occurred to me that wasn't the case, and so I just went out looking for them, and eventually found some good conversation partners and good books to read and so forth. And the kind of public policy engagement I was involved in was with a group of people who were like, here is a whole bunch of data and stats and research problems to solve, but also here is a stack of systematic theology textbooks that we expect you to read in the next 2 weeks. And so we did. It was really fun. And so we read all the usuals, from Greame to Grents and all that sort of stuff in the first couple of weeks of that program. So for me, in terms of vocation, I guess possibly the way to frame it out of the Greece would be to go that became a series of framing questions for me. So one was, how do you form Christian leaders who actually are shaped by biblical imagination and living out in all areas of life? And that became a really driving point. The other was, which began to emerge over the subsequent years, is, okay, so what does it mean for this gospel that we have to shape the world? So I was really comfortable with our vocabulary of salvation, and our narratives around salvation, that Christ comes to save you and I and all people. But I was less comfortable with how we talked about what does it mean to say that the gospel leads us into social and cultural transformation. So that drove for me further research around going, what does it look like when people live faithfully out of the gospel over longer periods of time, through social and cultural reform. So groups like, it's ended up being doctoral research and other things, groups like the Clapham sect and so forth. So coming back to then the question of calling, I think for me it's been that those dual pieces but coming together of what does it mean to say that the Christian mind or the Christian imagination leads us to engagement with the world, and what does that look like, and what does it look like over long periods of time, because it turns out God seems to quite enjoy process. He does do some things miraculously and quickly, but he also tends to enjoy taking his people on a 1,000-year journey, or in our case, a couple of 1,000 years at least. And while Christ may return tomorrow or next week, which would be wonderful, there is also that sense that God is probably calling us more and more to store up oil and to be planning for those long nights while we wait for the bridegroom to come back. So what does that look like as Christians, and how do we actually live faithfully while we're doing that? And what does it look like to, that classic line of Jesus is coming back, look busy? What does it look like to actually be busy about the work of building his kingdom and being involved in that?
So implicit in all of that, you're saying that something was lost though for the Christian leader. There's a story that's been lost that they didn't quite have a good hold on, that you had caught sight of and thought, how do we grow leaders into this story? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, I guess,
especially around your friends, they seem to have fallen away where you hadn't.
Yeah, well, I'm fallen away. Yeah, so there were some basic disconnects that seemed to me to be required to live plausibly as Christians, and that for various reasons people hadn't been able to join the dots, or just hadn't had conversation partners to help them. And so I guess so when you say things that I sort of saw, I'm not sure I saw them at the more I had some good friends, older people who helped me, who asked me good questions when I was younger.
Yeah.
That helped me frame things. So one of them really simply was an older man who I still deeply respect and have connection with, who when I was in my early 20s, he would have been probably in his 60s, and had said to me very early on, one of the things you should do is go out and talk to a whole bunch of older people who you really respect and who you want to be like, who are in their 60s, 70s, 80s and 90s, and ask them what they did to be those kind of people. And so I did.
That's
and
awesome.
so you end up going up and talking to these 90-year-olds or 80-something-year-olds who are like, I want to be like you, and looking for commonalities. Like, what did they do to stay faithful across decades? How did they build in? I don't think many people plan their lives ahead, but what were the things that when they look back, they're like, I'm really grateful I did these things. I'm really grateful I lived in these ways. And so that drew out some common themes that have been really shaping for me. And one of those things was many of them identified relatively early on a series of driving questions, but then also took time out to actually wrestle with them, be it through formal study or other means. And in doing that, built up a body of story that they then taught out of, lived out of, for in many cases decades, and that provided both a genuine resource, a genuine well for them to live and teach and lead out of, but also it shaped their it sharpened their sense of calling, and it shaped their sense of discernment as to what exactly they should be doing. So those are the kind of people who tended to. They often did it actually mid and later life, sort of in their 30s through 50s, and it often shaped that kind of period of significance, not in a classic, you go from success to that, but in a sense of, there was a deep sense of calling and discernment. So I guess for me, because part of this question was how did I end up in a place like Laidlaw, it certainly wasn't sought, but it was a sense of actually these things combine and they converge. So I care deeply about the way that the Christian imagination is shaped, and I care deeply about the shape of Christian leadership, and I also care deeply about how faithfulness gets transmitted and gets written onto the landscape of wider society and culture. And it seems to me Laidlaw is one of those institutions. It's certainly not the only in Aotearoa, but it's one of those ones that combines those particular unique things. And so there was that sense of, okay, if I care about Christian leadership here, this is a pretty cool place to be hanging out for a while, and a pretty good group of people.
I've heard you say that if you weren't the national principal of Laidlaw College, that you'd be finding a way to create a place like Laidlaw College somewhere else.
That was a slightly frustrating part of the discernment process, frustrating in a good sense, and that sometimes when you feel called by God, you also feel a little bit like the insect with the pin through them, going, why am I stuck to this board for now? There was that sense of, when God skewers you or the Spirit's convicting you, part of it was that realization, if Laidlaw didn't exist, I would probably be going out and trying to form something like this, so I should probably talk more to these people. That other sense of Laidlaw, it's 100 years old now as an institution. So that's 4 generations. Everything I know about historical and cultural change and the way that institutions hold faithfulness, most institutions lose their way at their first or third generational transition. Very few hold on to their DNA and ethos and sense of calling and mission consistently across the third. Particularly once, so either the founding generation failed to hand it over, or the grandchildren, the ones who knew the founders, failed to hand on the ethos. And so Laidlaw is one of those ones where, again, over 100 years now, you can look back and see a very, very consistent DNA that has evolved and shifted, but the same, you could compare the founding deed of this college and look at what we're doing and the way that the patterns of life and living are going on here, and there's remarkable consistencies. We still care about many of the same things, in different vocabulary sometimes, but it's the same beating heart a century later, and that's pretty impressive for any community to be holding on to certain threads of the gospel and certain senses of calling in the world for that length of time is a unusual thing in the world.
Can you name those first callings? What is it that Laidlaw holds on to?
Yeah, so things like so what we call our 4 affirmations is one example. So we did an exercise about 4 years ago when year or so into when I'd started here, where we went back through all of the documentation we could find about every time someone in leadership or someone in the college was talking about what does this place stand for. It was in the founding trust deed, sort of prospectuses from the 1940s and 60s. We found a whole series of talks given by past principals that would go around the churches in New Zealand and talk about what Bible Training Institute and Bible College and now Laidlaw have always been about. We went through all the material around when we rebranded as Laidlaw College, why we did that, and what parts of our story we thought we were prioritising in that sense. Turns out to be remarkably consistent series of themes, and so we packaged those up into 4 very, very simple phraseologies which convey an evangelical orthodoxy, but also convey a sense of mission in the world. So the Bible is our story, very simple, and obviously you can talk about that at length. We do. Jesus is our Lord, and again, a very simple statement, but that conveys a vast amount of meaning about how we centre ourselves in Christ. What does it mean to say that Christ compels the world, and so forth. The church is our community. Again, that sense of speaking about who it is we're serving, but who are our stakeholders, who has a right to be in conversation with us, and that sense of interdenominational engagement. And then finally, renewal is our vocation. So those 4 things actually in many ways would have been expressed very, very clearly in the founding trust deeds. In fact, there are essentially those same bullet points in slightly different language, but it still talks about Christ, the Bible, the church, and mission.
That's amazing.
And there are different ways to present it across the century.
Now we're going to get into the meat, I think. Because you just framed it. You framed it beautifully, I think. You talked about your calling, and then what you hinted on really, I think, nicely, is how you're sensing that there's a need for faith to be integrated into the whole person, not just as I follow Jesus, but then I do other stuff somewhere else. No, it's like the whole person. Lived faith. Lived faith, but then
worn faith. Yeah.
But then you mentioned how God could do something quickly, but it seems like we're trying to build a foundation for something to be more prolonged and fruitful over generations. My question is, what is the role of an institution like Laidlaw or similar institutions when it comes to this idea of, I guess, helping the gospel move forward in Aotearoa, New Zealand?
Yeah, so one of the tensions we often make is between the kind of the institutional, which is seen as impersonal, and it can be, and it's worse they can be, and the personal. One way is just to simply think about the institutions are forms of human agency that continue on intergenerationally, that can continue on beyond the presence of the person who first willed it, and that involves a sense of transfer and transmission, and a sense of people picking up batons, and it allows freedom to others, but fundamentally institutions carry on human agency beyond one person, and that's a really good thing when it's done well. As we all know, and we're surrounded by all sorts of examples of institutional failure and injustices and so forth. Institutions can be deeply damaging, they can be deeply unjust, like all human things, but at their best they also are one of those vehicles by which Christian hope can genuinely be conveyed, because what an institution can do is not just mobilise the collective efforts of a community and give it form and structure and discipline, but it can also carry these things forward. And there are ways that can be done that are themselves explicitly expressions of Christian hope. We have hope of resurrection, so we, above all people, have reasons to think that the things we do while we're living, even if we don't see the fruit, actually can still be expressions of hope in the world. So, that joke about, when's the best time to plant a fruit tree? Yesterday, and the next best time is today. That sense of, we should all be doing this kind of investment and even more so as Christians, because I don't need to see the fruit of the things that I do because I have hope of resurrection. I don't even need to see that my children or my great-grandchildren will see the fruit. As long as I have been faithful and invested in ways that actually will plausibly bring forth fruit, then that's a good thing, and that God himself promises to blow on our embers and to water the seeds and so forth. So an institution like Laidlaw becomes absolutely critical because it becomes an intergenerational vehicle for the transmission of mission, the transmission of the gospel, and for the holding of certain kinds of faithfulnesses on behalf of the wider church in a place like Aotearoa, where it's not to say it replaces the church, but it does supplement the kind of work that other institutions like congregations do. And I've talked in other contexts about what I sometimes call the timelinesses of the gospel, that sense of the gospel operates on different time frames. So rightly, evangelicals have emphasised and continue to emphasise the nowness of the gospel. Wesley's make haste, come to Christ. Christ compels us to convert, to repent, to be baptised, to sign up to the roster, to give to the church, to do all the good things of faithfulness. These are necessary imperatives that should change our actions today, tomorrow, next week, and next year, and they should change our patterns of living, and they should become new habits for us. Yeah. Sometimes in emphasising the nowness of the gospel, I think the evangelical movement in its broad sense has forgotten or let atrophy the lifelong and intergenerational time spans of the gospel, and those are ones that institutions help us remember. And the best institutions focus us on the longer term arcs. So, a good example that I can think about or that I could name would be, so we worshipped in a very small little parish church in the UK, the Church of England Church, that's been going for well over 1,000 years. And in a context where there's been long stands of worshipping communities, about 500 years ago. So in fact in 1523, a man set up a trust, gave a bunch of small fields in what was then a very rural part of Oxfordshire to this church parish for the use of the gospel and for mission, and particularly for the support of poor in the community and for education. And that charity has gone through different seasons over the last 5 centuries. It's been at different times not actively managed, but actually it's been reasonably well stewarded across 5 centuries. Wow. And so remarkably, that charity still continues and is a source of income for the church, does a huge amount of missional activity, is a major blessing to that small community, but also actually has been one of the sustaining functions of the work of the gospel in that area for, it'll be 500 years next year. That kind of thing is utterly remarkable, because again, what it's meant is that generations of people have been able to do things that they would not have been able to do without that kind of long arc investment and that institution, and a very light touch institution. It's not like it's built large buildings or required huge boards or vast fundraising enterprises. Just small groups of faithful people faithfully transmitting this charitable trust forward and recognising that they've been given something that actually has to be passed on and improved, and have done. And that is an institution, and the will of one person, carried now by the will of probably hundreds across the course of centuries, has actually borne remarkable fruit at a very modest, and it's like it's changed the world, but it has retained faithfulness in a particular context that is just, is remarkable. And so, if you think about what leadership is doing things that you wish people had done 30 to 50 years ago in your own time. What do we wish we had been handed, and then just trying to hand that on to others. That it's that kind of sense of building things that provide coat hooks and tent pegs for faithfulness, which turns out that most humans don't have sufficient will to be faithful fully in all areas of their life. Institutions are one way to peg that and to guard our faithfulness and to guard the faithfulness of others by creating things that live beyond our will.
So the need for institutions is massive for, I want to get into this not now, but at some point, for renewal within society, especially Christian institutions. Why do you think so many organizations, whether churches or nonprofits or parachurch organizations, why do you think they have difficulty transitioning from an organization to an institution? That generation to generation handover.
So I think some of it is human memory. So there are rhythms around how humans actually transmit things. And the answer, obviously we transmit things imperfectly. So none of us are perfectly discipled and none of us perfectly disciple others. None of us perfectly live out of the way that our parents have taught us, and so on and so forth. So in that sense, it makes sense that institutions tend to fail at that first and third generation because of the dynamics of human memory. So founders often aren't able to fully capture what it is that makes them so unique and so capable in their own vocations, and they aren't always fully able to tell people and to communicate and then to form others into that. And so in that sense, that first generation transition is so critical as a failing point. The third generation, I think, is also similarly explicable, slightly harder, but in the sense that usually it's people who knew the founder who may not have the same unique set of vocation, but they can imagine what their grandfather or grandmother did, and they knew what it was to be with that person. And so it's like the "what would Jesus do" question. They can imagine what that person would do in the scenario, and they can intuit it because they walked with them and they lived with them. But part of the difference is that they have by that point been maintaining a thing, and they have an imagination, but that imagination was experiential and never articulate and never instantiated in the thing. So I think institutions become those things where they have moved beyond that space of this is just something that someone intuits or remembers because of a person or because of a personal relationship to. No, this is something that people have worked out how to actually communicate or articulate in ways that can be transmitted beyond the immediate personal relationship. Something like marriage is a good example, actually, because obviously all of us experience, or many humans experience, unique marriages, and every marriage is unique and is built on a unique relationship. But the idea of marriage as an institution is an important one because everybody knows what is required of marriages in general. And over millennia, humans have worked out these are the kind of conditions that you put around to make these kind of relationships faithful and mutually fulfilling and so forth. And Christians have engaged deeply with that. Again, when the gospel first comes to those tribes in northern Germany, it takes centuries of engagement to change the marriage pattern to include things like consent, for example. Mutual consent is a normative function in marriages. Took centuries for the church canon law to really impose that and to make that normative. It's now so normative that if I say the phrase "I do," everybody knows that I'm referring to a marriage ceremony. It's a unique phrase that expresses consent or human will to enact, but that has actually become a metonym for that institution of marriage. And so many things like that capture what we all actually know marriage to be. And so in that sense, marriage is something that has, in scripture, been set up by God, but actually has also been enculturated and informed by lots and lots of human lives living towards this one end, that now individuals, humans, can enter into a relational arrangement that is so much more than a contract, another institution, or a transactional dynamic, but is actually something that has been established as a way of living, and that sets a pattern of expectation, and which probably flows onto that other piece of what institutions do. Institutions allow us to trust in the world in particular ways and not to think about things. So for example, I don't have to wonder where most of the food in my life comes from. We grow a little bit because we have a wee veggie plot, but fundamentally I trust that certain institutions will grow food, ship it, make it hygienic, make sure it's healthy, make sure there are no chemicals or other things that would harm me. I trust our food health inspectorates and so forth. I trust all of these things. And I therefore don't have to closely inspect things that I buy in the supermarket. And that's a good thing.
It'd take you forever.
Yeah, it makes,
every fruit you pick up,
and there are different jokes. There's this gentleman, for example, who made a sandwich from scratch. It took him 6 months. He grew his own wheat. He grew his own everything. ground it, produced it, baked it, and so forth, and made a sandwich. There's a huge amount of work that institutions take away from us, but there's a trust dynamic that they bring.
Well,
that's a good point. Are you
let me
on
ask
that one?
That.
Yeah.
So I'm really nervous asking this question on the back of your marriage analogy, but I'm guessing institutions die at two ends of a scale. They die when they don't adapt, when they just become like rock solid and static, but they also die when they lose the foundation and they become too open. So how do you hold as an institution that tension of needing to adapt and to change, or needing to bring in other voices that may need to push the boundaries of the institution, but then still retain what the institution was grounded upon?
Yeah. So rather than thinking of institutions as kind of a bundle of rules or structures or systems, which is a really normal way to think about them, but I don't think is an imperfect way of thinking. I would tend to think of institutions in those terms of trust and in terms of a system of conditions of trust. So, and the conditions of trust change, and so as a result, the institution itself may not change in its name, but its form needs to change. And again, the church is a good example of this. The church is, at least large parts of the church, proven remarkably adept at reforming its structures and its systems and its processes, and that's why we have sometimes cataclysmic things like reformations, where the thing that needs to be held in trust, the community centered around the gospel at work and mission in the world, recognizes that it needs to change a huge amount about its forms and processes and structures and hierarchies in order to keep that basic condition of trust. And so in some senses, I think you can see an institutional continuity, but there are also points of crisis, and those points of crisis are usually where an institution has ceased to maintain the conditions of trust that require that institution or allow that institution to be valid in that sense, and to be something that people should commit to. And there are also times, I think, again, one of the freedoms of being people who are shaped by a resurrection vision of the world is to go, we don't put our hope in institutions. It's okay when things die, even long arc things. I think it's always easier to maintain that which is given to us, and that's a good thing. So we should be careful not to let things die too early. It's worth fighting for certain things, but alternatively, I don't think we should necessarily be too ashamed to go, no, we actually concluded on missional or other grounds that this thing needs to shut down. That's okay. So that tension of, I think, institutions, and I think particularly in a country like New Zealand where so many of our institutions are so young, we I think simultaneously reify them and therefore don't pay attention to what is, I'll use the phrase secret sauce, what is the unique combination of trust factors that make this thing really work. Alternatively, I think sometimes we're a little too laissez-faire with our institutions, and we treat them as though that is impervious, eternal things, and don't recognize that they can often be very vulnerable. And often, all institutions by definition are really only one generation away from failure. That point of failure, that point of transmission can happen at any point.
Okay, so here's like, I don't know how much we're going to get into this because it's really open-ended. I think we laid a good foundation here to get into this. So Laidlaw is the fourth affirmation is renewal is our vocation.
Yes.
Arguably, that should be the vocation of like the church and, those who call themselves followers of Jesus. We want to be people of renewal.
I would say it is, just to be clear.
Yes, okay.
As also statements like Jesus is our Lord. These are affirmations of the church, but they're things that we as a college want to say animate us. And if we couldn't say those things, then the basic conditions of trust that us as an institution, that motivate us as an institution would have been broken, and we would no longer be true to that which we were called to, and the reasons why we exist. Probably if I could draw the distinction between the congregational church or the church gathered in that sense, and a more missional part of the body of Christ, like Laidlaw, is that we're not a congregation, we are a college.
Yeah.
So we serve in different ways. And if you like, if congregations are very much about that now timeliness, they exist to foster the faithfulness of the people gathered, to encourage them, to build them up, to send them out for the wider work of the church in all its forms. Colleges do the same, but on a different time frame. So we are interested more in the lifelong and intergenerational faithfulness of our graduates and those who form part of our community. Not to say that congregational churches aren't, but we hold that people come here and they spend weeks or months or years with us, investing in a way where the immediate gospel payoff may not be always apparent. They're doing that longer work of formation, which I think has always been the work of the church, but it's not the kind of thing that you can do on a Sunday worship service necessarily. No. But you can do it 3 years of study.
Yeah.
So you don't see Laidlaw as, I mean, would this be right that, you don't see Laidlaw sitting alongside the church. You see it inside the church.
Well, we're part of the body of Christ.
Yeah.
We're not a church
Yes.
in the sense, but we do as the gathered people of God. I mean, where 2 or 3 are gathered, and we do the things that the church does in many senses. We worship, we pray, we have fellowship together, we encourage each other as members of the body of Christ and so forth, but we do so for very particular missional purposes. So just like you might look at a missionary society and say, well, is that part of the church or not? Well, yes, it is. It is a community of people, but it's a community of people whose distinctive is not the gathered nature and the kind of they're not a local community. They're a very particular missional arm of the church. And so perhaps one way to think about it is to look at the difference between the internal organs and the hands and feet of the church. We occupy a particular vocational part within the church's much wider vocation to renew the world.
So back to my question. All right, good tangent, guys. All right, so renewal. A lot of pastors that I rub shoulders with, they talk about praying for revival. All right? We're going to use that term revival. And we're praying for revival. And to be honest, I have a hard time understanding what they actually mean by that word. And I think they mean something along the lines of the church growing, more people coming to know Jesus. And the church having, even some people might see that as like more influence in society, right? But there's also this idea of renewal. How would you define renewal in society, and maybe specifically Aotearoa? What does that actually practically look like? And is that the same as like what maybe a lot of pastors and churches are praying for, which is this sometimes inadequately defined sense of wanting revival, like this thing that happened in the past to happen again in the present? Mm-hmm. Yeah, what would you say to that?
So Jesus comes to renew his world. As he walks around, and we see this particularly in the Gospel of John, he looks very much like the Creator walking around renewing his world. So he, just like the Spirit of God hovered over the waters in Genesis, so Christ in the second Genesis stands on the chaos waters of the Sea of Galilee and speaks order into it. He turns water into wine. He tells Nicodemus, you must be born again. So Jesus is coming to renew the whole of creation, and he does so specifically to renew peoples, to renew hearts and minds, to that great phrase of the renovation of the soul, the reformation of the world. So within that general calling, that all Christians now participate within God's recreation of the world, and we are people who, just like Adam was called to participate in God's creation, so now we, the people of Christ, are called to participate in the new creation. Revival and which just means bringing back to life, or to restore life, or renovation, the sense of bringing newness, or reforming, the sense of bringing a new form or changing the form to create health and life. These things are perennial Christian callings. I think you're talking particularly about that sense that there are periods where by the Spirit's moving and by human faithfulness, and usually in combination, God seems to draw new, fresh, large numbers of people to his church. But there is that sort of strange irony in that in many of the instances we see in history, revivals, in the classic sense of, a large move of the Spirit by which unexpectedly large numbers of people come to faith, they tend to be 5 to 15 year events, in the sense that after about 15 years, there is not a net number of people worshipping, calling Christ Lord in that locale, that not a net increase. So there tends to be a big spike, and then actually there's quite a quick drop-off. So in that sense, in very large number of instances throughout history, you get moves of the Spirit that lead to large numbers of conversions, and then the church doesn't do a good job at discipling those people and, if you like, growing the base. So one of my own areas of study is to look at what are the conditions, or what kinds of things do you see when you get both large numbers of people coming to faith, quickly or slowly, and those people stay faithful, and the church grows in really meaningful terms relative to the wider population, or in numerical terms, or however you frame it. And it turns out that one of the things that almost always happens is where you get revival that becomes permanent growth, and permanent growth in the Christian population is new institutional forms, or renewed institutional forms, and significant amounts of cultural and social renewal that go on around that. So basically, it's not just that a large number of people call Christ Lord and come to the light and stand around it like moths to the flame, but actually that they then find whole new ways to live as a new community, or as that renewed community, and they do so. So, for example, the classic in the English-speaking world is the evangelical revival or renewal of the 18th century, where, yes, a very large number of people come to faith through mass preaching, people like Wesley and Whitfield and Venn and others. There are lots and lots of other evangelistic outreaches in those early decades that continue, but that embeds itself in whole new forms of church, and whole new forms of mission, and whole new institutional structures. And so in that process, they do things like invent missionary societies or Bible societies, because it turns out Bible societies, and prior to Bible societies, what are called book societies, or tract societies that produce literature, for example, that fosters faithfulness. And so people coming to Christ from the 1730s, 40s and 50s, by the 1760s, 1780s, are being rapidly fed by these publishing institutions that are producing a huge amount of literature that then reads, that then disciples, and so forth. By the 1780s, you've got things like Sunday school societies that are rapidly propagating educational forms for children, but also in that period for adults, that actually take people who've newly come to Christ and form them, and bring them into communities of learning and growth and discipleship that actually make them lifelong Christians and make them faithful. One of the things you see a lot in that period is people, quote, making a commitment to Jesus, but then very quickly being given something like a Bible from these new Bible societies, in which they write their name, the date of their conversion, often a little testimony that goes in that, and that becomes something that actually anchors their faithfulness. But then also, obviously, because in that period, these are often newly literate parts of the population, Bibles can anchor faithfulness within a family context, because they're then being read to the children in ways that hadn't happened prior to that in the household, or in that household. And so a Bible that tells the conversion story of a parent can then actually become a part of the family story, and actually goes on to generate more and more faithfulness as this becomes something that is passed on generation to generation. And so all that to say, God does and continues to work in surprising ways, but very often you find that the Spirit of God is going before and after. There's things that we see in the human cultural landscape that we call revivals, to prepare pathways for longer term formation, and those things are often much less understood because they're just less exciting. it's really interesting and exciting when large numbers of people gather in fields outside London to hear a really dynamic speaker, and hundreds, if not thousands of them come up to, what we now call altar calls, to give their lives to Christ. It's much less exciting to recognise that years before that, or within that same period, someone set up a society that ended up producing a whole bunch of literature that actually turned out to be utterly critical in the story of many of those people. And we're also not that good at joining the dots, because we don't necessarily think in these kind of wider terms in the way we tell our stories.
So I hear you. What I hear you saying is that it seems to me that the gospel is passed on by an interweaving of two things. One is the institutional, the large scale, building a lived-in gospel into the structures of our worlds. Be that the family unit, be that the government, be that, whatever, the big kind of institutional things. But then there's another stream that must stream through that gets entwined seems to me to be that personal experience, that the gospel is true for me, therefore it's worth me buying into this big institutional stream. Is that am I hearing you correctly? Is there another stream in there that we haven't picked up on yet?
Well, I might just modify it and say when I talk about institutions, I don't necessarily mean big things. So what institutions do is they anchor and make plausible the things that we don't always feel all the time. So
that's a good way to
put it. A good way to think about it. So in the 18th century, I'm an historian, so I'm going to just keep giving historical examples. So in the 18th century, a large number of people are moving from rural parishes to urban contexts. So they're moving from places where previously, for generations and often for centuries, their families had been living, and the faithfulness that their family may or may not have lived out of have been fostered by the small institutional matrix of the parish. So they all go to the same church. They go to the local charity school. There's the births, deaths and marriages register that makes them part of the parish. There's the overseers of the poor, so if the family falls on hard times and so forth. And so in that context of hundreds, if not 1,000, maybe 1,500 people living in one little community, everybody knows each other, and faithfulness is fostered by the network of institutions and frameworks that support that. So you walk down the street of your village in rural England, and most people know you, and they know you should be in church in that moment.
Totally.
And so that builds
that's the structural kind of the gospel.
And it's very plausible to live faithfully in this context, because everybody in your community goes to church on Sunday. You all sing the same songs. You read the liturgy.
That's right.
And you're taught from the Bible and so forth. So all of that's going on.
You're carried in a net of the structure of the culture, right? I mean, there's a safety.
The sort of mesh of institutions that we call the parish is what supports faithfulness. It may not create the spark in the human heart. That's the work of God and the Spirit and the preaching of the Word and the act of conversion and repentance, but it fosters it and makes it livable in that sense. So imagine that same person somewhere in the middle of the 18th century, which happened to hundreds of thousands of people, if not millions, is suddenly moved into an urban context where, unlike in their village, most people they pass in the street are strangers to them. And they don't have a personal relationship with their vicar, because that vicar is trying to pastor thousands of people, and so on and so forth. And so the ripple effects of that for the institutional fabric of faithfulness are quite significant. And so that's part of what goes on in the evangelical renewal. So that person may show up to a street preacher or to a field preacher, stand in a crowd of 10,000, hear the word, hear the message, be convicted, and have their heart warmed, convert, and come to Christ. But then the question is, how do they live faithfully as Christians? And that's partly what the evangelical renewal does, is it develops a whole series of new institutional frameworks to support faithfulness in that kind of context. So to give a very simple example, there were these things that are called Reformation of Manners societies that had been going on since the late 17th century. That become, it's a really catchy title. They were really good at, obviously worked at the time. To put it really simply, they're basically small groups. They're home groups. So they're these groups that meet in people's houses, where you actually build a fellowship and a community that's geographical and relational, but it's not predicated on, well, our great-grandparents used to live in the same village. This is a community that forms, that disciples each other, that reads the word together, that teaches each other, and that can sit within these larger structures, like these big urban churches, where the parish has become so stretched that actually there's large numbers of people. So the institution the institution doesn't do the work of the Spirit, but it can anchor it and structure it and foster faithfulness in that sense. And actually, so much of our habits and so much of the practices that keep us faithful, even when we don't necessarily want to be, are themselves anchored on institutions. So, so the fact that we have something as basic as Sunday worship services, where you have a community of people who might miss you if you don't show up, I think it certainly makes me more faithful, because it means, and that rhythm, and it's a habit and it's a practice, but it's also more than that. It's something that has been going for a very long time, where there is this gathered group of people just down the road from where we live who expect me to show up at roughly 10 o'clock on a Sunday morning, and who will keep showing up if I don't show up, and that kind of thing actually generates faithfulness, and certainly reinforces it. So I don't think we ever want to create a picture of Christianity or gospel faithfulness that doesn't center itself on this is the work of the Spirit in the world that calls us miraculously by God's grace to Christ. But I also don't think we want to be naive and say it's just this sort of these series of forces in the world. These things actually get anchored in the human world, and there are tent pegs that we put in around them, and those can often be deeply good, and they form the guy ropes and the poles of our structure.
That's incredibly helpful.
That's a great explanation.
That's awesome. Yeah.
So, kind of pivoting a little bit, you're a future thinker. You did a great thing during an all staff thing where you
checks his watch.
Yeah, as a check. What time is it? We're not going to talk about the whole future. Don't worry. We've only got a little bit of time left. But you did a great thing about what would Laidlaw look like 100 years from now, or whatever, right? And you painted that picture. It's super aspirational, however, as it should be, because who can actually predict that? But let's actually maybe minimize this a little bit and talk about Aotearoa. What do you think the spiritual landscape or the church landscape or Christian institutional landscape of New Zealand might morph into, and what might be some challenges or some opportunities within that?
You're asking big questions.
Well, you're very
these are good things to ask. So
you're a connected guy, so I feel like you've a pulse on things more than most would on what's happening in the country.
And to throw another line to there that might help. I mean, why should we think about that?
Yeah.
Because honestly, we've got enough to deal with today. Yeah. And why should we be thinking big?
Yeah, no, agreed. Yeah. So I have lots of detailed thoughts on this. I'm going to rather than go into specifically what I think it might look like. I might just go up to a height, one step above, and go, what are some of the things that I'm reasonably confident will be features of our institutional and church landscape?
Yeah, that's good.
In say 100 years, if we are still faithful, and if there is still a vibrant, growing church that is ministering the gospel. So one of the things that I think New Zealand needs to, and the New Zealand church needs to focus on quite dramatically, is the long arc. We are a young country. We have a kind of number 8 wire mentality, which has so many strengths. And
what's that analogy?
So the mentality. So that sense.
Make do.
Yeah. So we're really good at. We're really good at tinkering away with something until we make it work. We're very pragmatic, and so we can make with a piece of wire, fencing wire. You can make anything work. And so that sense of we will tackle any project in a long weekend, and that's really brilliant. And we get a lot done in a long weekend. And that sense of ingenuity and innovation and entrepreneurship. The dark side of that, or the shadow side of that, is that sometimes there is the sense, I think, in Aotearoa where if it can't be done in a long weekend, we have this sort of subtle implication that it's not worth doing.
That's great.
If you can't get it done that quickly, then why would you do it? So we don't necessarily engage in projects that actually will take much longer. So a good example is cathedrals. Cathedrals mostly in Europe take 200 years plus to build. Even today, if you think about the Sagrada Familia in Barcelona and other places.
Now Notre Dame.
Yeah,
it's got to be rebuilt.
Yeah. Some being rebuilt these days, and all the other things like these kind of things take time.
Yeah.
And there's good reasons for that. It's not just because of building technology and so forth. There's actually structural reasons why you can't build these things fast. So I can't think of many, if anything, that we are building in the church in Aotearoa these days where we genuinely have a 200-year time frame. I don't think it has to be built architecture. So, for example, the global missions project that the church engaged in the beginning of the late 18th century, that's a multi-century project. So the project of translating the gospel, translating the scriptures into new languages, and preaching to all the peoples of the world, in that sense, that's something that we began doing about 2.5, 3 centuries ago, and it turns out to have been a very good thing. It's not complete yet, but it's the kind of ambitious, large-scale project. And so, if you like, missionary societies are a cathedral-like institution. Bible societies and the work of translating the Bible into all the known languages of the world, that's a cathedral-like institution or a cathedral-like project. So one of the reasons why cathedrals are good, not just because they're beautiful and so forth, is because they foster faithfulness. There are still people who come to faith because of things that were built 1,000 years ago, and they walk into them, and their eyes are drawn up to Christ, and they recognise the transcendence and so forth. The college that I was privileged to study at in the UK has been a worshipping cathedral community for 14 centuries. It was started by some Anglo-Saxon nuns roughly 1,400 years ago, and they have maintained patterns of worship, daily prayer, and study of the Word and of the world in that context for well over a millennia. New Zealand doesn't do that very well. So one of the things that I think, if you like, the long-term consequences of our short-term thinking, that great phrase, are really coming home to roost now. And if we are going to have a vibrant, growing, faithful church that's not struggling as we are in 100 or 200 years, we need better institutions, and we need longer arc institutions. So we need institutions that are basically saying, what can we do now that will bear fruit but may not be a significant fruit across the course of our lifetime, but will ensure that our great-grandchildren are more faithful. We need that kind of thing. So that's one instinct, just to say that one of the features of our landscape going forward, I think, has to be longer-term thinking and planning. And so that means certain kinds of investing. It's why I'm at a place like Laidlaw, is because it turns out investing in leaders and in leadership culture and in the people to do this, and also building institutions like colleges that tend to have longer arcs of existence and tend to have longer arcs of faithfulness, is a really needful thing in this time. So it would be one thing. I think another feature that I'm certain will be part of our world, again, assuming we do it well, I'm as confident as I can be, is I think as the connectivity between the local and the global changes, we're going to need to rethink a lot of the missional specificity. So I'll try and simplify a lot of thought into a few sentences here, but Bible societies do things that no local congregation or parish can do in the 18th, early 19th century. No parish can travel to the other end of the world, meet a new people group, learn the language, translate scriptures into that, build printing presses at scale, and then ship Bibles in the new language to that thing and distribute them. No parish can do that. Bible societies can. So what Bible societies in the early 19th century end up being is new forms of institutions that carry a very, very particular missional specificity on behalf of the global church, and do so in ways that leverage the strength of local Christian community and fellowship, and but connect it to a global project that no individual parish can engage in. One of the intriguing features of our world, and one of the shifts that's going on as globalization has kind of taken another step in this last 30 to 50 years, has been that for many of us, actually, many of the things that 3 centuries ago no parish or no local congregation could do, it turns out now through technology and resources we can do. So 50 years ago, it would have been difficult, not impossible, but difficult for a local church to send a missionary. Now, the 3 of us could get on a plane with pieces of plastic that are currently in our pockets and go on a mission trip. You know, every church can run its own local mission trip. You know, I mentioned Bible societies. There are dozens of examples on Kickstarter and various other projects that demonstrate that actually any man and his dog can produce their own version of the Bible these days. Whether one should is another question, but they can. And so if our local congregation wanted to translate the Bible, print it, and distribute it, we could do that. It wouldn't be a great use of our resources, but it's possible. Same with Bible colleges. So 50 years ago, no one congregation could easily have set up the kind of infrastructure for the kind of deep biblical and theological teaching. Now actually through downloading stuff from the internet and podcasts and a certain lowering of the bar and various other things, actually many congregations could do that if they wish to, and some do. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, but it does reconnect that relationship between what does the gathered community of Christians attempt, and what is the missional forms of the church in the global world. Right. So not all of us can do all forms of mission all the time, and we're going to need new, but many of us can now, and so we're going to need new forms. And you're seeing some of these things come into being in particular ways. So different forms of the church sometimes say, okay, well, we will do things like put a youth worker in our local school. That will be our specific missional connection. Right. Or we will support these missionaries in global contexts or whatever. But I think part of it is because just as in the 18th and 19th century, the connection between the global and the local changed, and that birthed this whole new world. The institutions that came out of that are now changing, and the connection between the local and the global is changing quite dramatically. I spoke to one of our recent graduates just yesterday who was preparing 3 talks this week, one for a church in India, delivered by Zoom, one for a local congregation in a different language here in Auckland, and one a study for another congregation in Palmerston North, also delivered by Zoom. 3 different studies, 3 different sermons, 3 different languages being presented from one of our houses here on campus. Wow. And brilliant and awesome, but also completely changing the dynamics of ministry in terms of the connectivity. So your question was, what kind of institutions are we going to need? We are going to need institutions where that kind of reality of different connectivities can actually be structured in a way that fosters faithfulness. Because, of course, in a world where if I really wanted to, I could worship and fellowship with a church in Southern California. Because it has the particular, unique, special vibe that I find so fulfilling for my own spiritual journey and time and place in life.
What is that vibe? I'm just kidding.
I don't know a particular church in Southern California. I'm just
looking pretty
here.
tanned.
It's not really my vibe. But anyway, that sense of like I could, if I wanted to, I could be a virtual member of that church. I could Zoom into all their meetings. I could, this is a hypothetical church, just to be clear. I could join their small groups via Zoom. Like I could live here in Auckland and do that. It would be a terrible idea because I would not be an accountable disciple to that community because I can disconnect myself at any moment. Now, I might be getting the best teaching in the world from this one pastor for my purposes for a particular season, so it wouldn't be wrong for me to access that. But if I was pegging my life and my discipleship journey on that set of relationships at a point where I actually have full agency to cut that tie, then I'm not sure I'm a disciple. I'm a consumer, a high efficacy agent in that sense. I have a high degree of choice. And so we need institutions that can help people be disciples, not just well-rounded consumers. So I wish that we had more well-rounded consumers of the Christian gospel, if that makes sense. I wish that people were engaging in a wider sense of formation, but actually what we need is ultimately not consumers. We need them to consume enough that they actually get the sense of, now I need to submit to this, and then institutions that will structure that submission in healthy ways.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point.
Yeah.
Because, I mean, it's good content. Why shouldn't I consume good content?
Yeah, there's nothing wrong with consuming good content.
But what you're saying is that it needs to be then grounded in some kind of, some place.
Yeah. If I listen to a preacher who is deeply encouraging 90% of the time, and then that 10% of the time absolutely nails me in terms of my own sin and my own need for growth and all of these things. And if I can turn that preacher off when it gets uncomfortable,
why not?
I'm potentially in trouble.
Yeah.
You know, and so I might have been built up by that 90% of brilliance, but if I'm not in relationship, so in some senses, I would often encourage, and do in fact encourage many people, to go for the slightly less well-dressed, slightly less well-presented, sometimes even slightly less insightful preacher down the road, who will chase you up, but also who will see you when you're having a bad day and ask you how you're doing, and can actually be that present, accountable support, and will be persistent in your life.
Who'll see a packet saver countdown.
That's great.
And be like, how you doing? Or, oh, I didn't see you last Sunday.
Exactly.
Oh, you know? Yeah.
And so don't get me wrong, I'm all for engaging in the world and availing ourselves of the resources that the wider world. I mean, I wish more people were reaching out to some of the extraordinary resources that are available to us to learn and to study, but also not as just really, really, really well-informed consumers, but people who are then going, what does it mean to live into that space?
It sounds like you're saying you'll be more engaged with your world. That's what I hear you saying. Get in, get involved, get dirty.
Well, and so one of the technical languages that sometimes is put around this is to say that the church exists in two forms: modalities, gathered communities, and sodalities, and so missional communities. And so we have two, and most of us live in multiple versions of this. So there are people who I gather with. And a place like Laidlaw is more the sodal end, although we have a lot of modality as well. We're all here because we want to study, we want to learn, we want to teach, we want to build each other up in particular ways. And there's a specificity. It's a self-selecting group of people who are engaged in a particular part of the church's mission. We don't claim to be the whole of the church or anything like that. And that can be really encouraging. It can also be very challenging. C.S. Lewis, but I think he puts it best in this one. He describes, I think it's in the Screwtape Letters, the gathered community of the church as that group of one's neighbours who one had hitherto desired to avoid or hitherto avoided. And he describes the experience of sitting in a pew and looking down and seeing your neighbour wearing an old cardigan and wishing you didn't have to hang out with that person. And that's what that's what the modal church does. I sit in, and this is not to disparage the people who go to the local church that we attend, but like I didn't choose to hang out with all of those people. In fact, some of those people are the gift of God's Spirit in my life because I didn't choose them. I will be uncomfortable to them, and they will be uncomfortable to me in good ways. And I need that in my life. I could stand and live my entire life with a very refined group of Christians who are exactly like me, who reinforce all my prejudices and who encourage me in all the ways that I like to be encouraged. And that would be brilliant. And I would have a very nice, very easy life. And I guess because I'm a relatively affluent, relatively well-educated, high choices person in the world, and most of us are, certainly in Aotearoa, I can choose that. I mustn't. It's not Christian faithfulness. And so all that to say, I think sometimes when we think about what kind of churches we need to be asking these kind of questions. I mean, it's basic stuff. The church has always been about discipleship, about formation, about growing people who are in mutual accountability. This is what Paul means when he says, submit to each other, that kind of idea. So we need to be having those kind of communities embedded in our lives and find ways that we can't escape them very easily. Alternatively, the missional possibilities and horizons of our world are growing, and our awareness of the need and the complexity of the need. I mean, we need people to go in and fix broken markets, fix climate, fix all sorts of social and economic injustices, fix all sorts of cultural injustices, create new cultures, and foster all sorts of flourishing and faithfulness in the world because of all of that. And so the horizons are unique, and because of the specificity of that, we're going to have all sorts of particular vocational callings emerge in the next generations that are extraordinary and rich, and with a high, if we do our job well, with a higher level of engagement in specific areas than ever before. But those people also need to be rooted in real diverse communities of people who are not the brilliant artist who's deeply thought about their theology, or are not the highly effective entrepreneur who is solving homelessness or whatever, that kind of idea, who are people who are like, well, why do you care about that? And, actually we've got this this other crisis going on in the church that's messy and difficult, and that you need to be part of as well.
So is it a broad and deep vision? Like we need to stay broad enough to be able to talk to all these topics that are arising in our world, but deep enough to give them some kind of root and some kind of...
as the church, this is the good thing, is that I don't have to do all of this, you don't have to do all of this, none of our listeners have to do all of this. We need to have a common vocabulary, we need to have and we need to work hard on that, and we need to all be basically well-formed. That sense of, in a world where you can be so specifically formed, and choose to be very specifically formed, it's actually really important to make sure we've got our bases covered. So again, that's why things like the four affirmations, if you don't have a faith that's enriched by scripture, that's centered on Christ, that's lived in church community and is engaged in mission, then in some ways it may not be a sinful in the sense of you might not be doing anything wrong, but it's a misformed in that it doesn't have that baseline. But then some people are very particularly called to live out of the biblical imagination on behalf of the wider church, and to be teachers of the word, and to encourage others into thinking about scripture, or to do it through art or music or anything else, or to teach Sunday school and to invite others into the scriptures. And that's wonderful. And that doesn't belie the work of other parts of the body, but it does mean some people are called to be for the community, for unity, for healing, for well-being, for flourishing, for that relational whanaungatanga that makes Christian community and fellowship so profound. That doesn't mean that they should ignore scripture or ignore mission in the outreach sense, or ignore renewal, but their calling might be to be the gathered body, and to work on the gathered body. Usually we call these people pastors. That sense of we are each other's brothers and sisters. We are the different parts of the body. So I don't see it as a both and. I don't see it as an either or. It's definitely a both and, but it's also I don't see it as necessarily us all having to go, oh my goodness, we just need to do 10 times more than we used to. But I think, I guess just as in the 18th century, large numbers of people lived for far too long, and often for generations, with the assumption that faithfulness was still being fostered by the parish institutions, and so didn't do that work on themselves and on their families and in their communities, and didn't notice that millions and millions of people, as they moved into urban areas or moved into continentally, were just losing that connectivity of faith. And that's partly what happened with New Zealand as a settler society. The institutions that we planted, Anglican, Methodist, Presbyterian, and many other denominational parishes and structures, didn't contextualize in the end. And so 4 to 6 generations after the fact, the faithfulness that those institutions were fostering, where they came from, has not borne all the fruit that we might have wanted to see. So I think a lot of people are not necessarily paying attention to the fact that in our contemporary churches, we are not... the plausibility of so many of the things that we have just always assumed that's what makes a church and that's what faithfulness, the plausibility of that is disappearing quite rapidly around us. COVID has... One of the things that COVID has done, which as many people have pointed out, is it has lowered the plausibility bar for the gathered community itself. So we've all just experienced... So if previously we'd all had a slight inclination to come to church because we actually enjoyed the worship, we enjoyed the teaching, so much of church. Actually, we've all just discovered that you can do that in your bedroom, in your pajamas. You can listen to probably a better sermon than your local minister might be able to pull together. The worship is probably better quality. Frankly, the coffee is usually better quality. All of the things. And you might be able to have a deep spiritual experience of God in your bedroom. So why then would you need to gather with fellow believers? Well, it turns out not just because Christ commands it. That's important, and Paul echoes that, and other writers in the New Testament. But there are goods in the gathering itself of fellowship and of mutual discipleship that cannot be replicated in your bedroom in your pajamas. But we haven't necessarily articulated those or for a long time.
Yeah.
We need to do that.
Yeah. And that's part of Laidlaw's, you see that as part of Laidlaw's vision or mission to be able to articulate that for people?
Yeah, I see that as part of what the church is doing, and the church must do. The church must continue to explain to people, this is why we do the things that we do. That's what that's what all good institutions do. They articulate, sometimes using words, usually just by demonstrating the meaning of it, why we do what we do.
Yeah.
And so for Laidlaw, again, we echo this because we are part of the church. We're not trying to do it for the church or to say that the church is doing a terrible job and therefore they need us. It's not that at all. But we are, we do things like we have doubled down. Before COVID, we obviously ran regular chapels and worship service and prayer and so forth, and we had been moving this way before COVID anyway, and COVID has just sort of reinforced the need for this. We do things like we produce prayer books and other resources to encourage people to do basic things that they should always do, like pray, that they might not remember to do because of the kind of wider societal shifts and the things that are happening in church. It's why we produce worship resources and all of these other things, and why we continue to meet even via Zoom for things like chapels and so forth, because that is part of reinforcing the thing. And study is part of that. Study is one of the things. Study in the sense of focusing your attention on what God is calling you to and how you will better prepare yourself to serve in that way. That's something that the church has always needed to do, and it is a spiritual discipline in its own right. And as writers like Simone Weil and others have reminded us over many generations, it is itself a form of prayer and worship, to focus the mind and the heart on God, His world, learning about ourselves within that, but also on what we then do to serve better. That's one of our distinctive things that we do. Yeah. We say to people, if you are a Christian, one of the things you should consider doing is studying, because if you say you believe in Jesus and you don't know anything about His word or His church or His world, or you haven't prepared yourself to serve more widely, you haven't possibly put your money where your mouth is. And not everyone is called to do that through formal courses or programs, but every Christian, we're transformed by the renewing of our mind. There's no that's a process that seems to involve a lot of work for most of us, certainly myself. Some people, no doubt, have these miraculous insights that reform our minds and renew our minds, but most of us, we have to read and study and debate and engage in these worlds. So
I think that's it. I think that's it. Well, thanks, Roshan, for throwing us a pro bono bone and coming out.
It's been fun.
We'd have no check in the mail, sorry. But this was awesome. We went everywhere. And we would love to have you back on when time allows.
Yeah, thank you guys. Appreciate it.
So good, man. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to Lunch on the Way, and if you enjoyed this conversation, please feel free to share it along on any platforms that you might have. And if you really liked this podcast, even if you haven't clicked the subscribe button yet, please do so, and write a review on whatever platform you use. Hopefully give it 5 stars. That'd be great. And a nice little review at the end. Just let us know that it's actually helpful and it maybe is fostering some conversations with you and your friends that you have, or even just helping you think through what it means to be a Christian and follower of Jesus in the world today. Anyway, thanks for listening.